repeat what Needham did, and that's Spallanzani. He repeated Needham's experiments, but he boiled them long enough to kill the spores. They still didn't know what they were talking about. But he boiled them long enough so that his boil samples remained lifeless until he broke them open and they were reinfected with new living forms that were in the environment. They were just carried in there by air. So, as these little tiny pieces of information get together and add up, along come number 9, 2 Dutch guys, Schroeder and Van Douche, and they figured out how to keep the air out of things. What they did was to boil the materials and cover them, stuff cotton balls in them. And that kept out the organisms, but allowed the oxygen to come in, and so he really created the first culture vessel that could be used to grow microorganisms. That would be analogous to our nutrient broth today. Only we don't use cotton plugs anymore because they were the darling of all laboratories because they would go up in flames occasionally. So now we use not a tight cap, but we use a plastic cap on our tubes that will keep the air out, but let the oxygen exchange in the air aerobic metabolic state. So Schroeder and Van Douche were the first ones to really make a contained item that would support life. And right after him, number 10, here's Louis Pasteur. There is not a soul in the world that has not heard of Louis Pasteur. And there probably is nothing in the microbial historical data that he doesn't claim credit for. But he did a lot, obviously, he did a lot. He was called in because the wine and beer industry in France was dying because the wine was spoiling. It was spoiling. So he worked on how to keep it fresh. It was a big economic thing over there. It still is a big economic thing over there. What did he do? He found out that if you partially heated some of the materials, like wine and beer, you could knock off the vegetative forms. And that would be enough to keep it from spoiling until it could be used. So we stick a name to that process, and what do we call it? Pasteurization. A big deal. It's not sterilization, as you know, because pasteurized milk can still go bad. But he was able to give them a longer shelf life, if you will, and that made sense to the industry because by that time they had sold their product and everybody had consumed it, so it was really good. And he claimed credit for saving the wine and beer industry, and that was true. So what is pasteurization? It's raising the temperature to 63 degrees, and this is a centigrade temperature, for 15 minutes. Keeping it at 63 degrees knocked off the vegetative forms. It did not sterilize, but in fact it pasteurized. Today we can buy pasteurized milk and we can buy sterilized milk. You know, the sterilized milk is in boxes on the shelves, no refrigeration. But as soon as you open it and anything from the air can get into it, it gets repopulated with microorganisms. So it's not effective forever unless you can absolutely keep the air out of it, which is really tough to do. And by the way, it tastes differently, doesn't it? Because boiling changes the flavor of milk. It changes it fairly radically, and some people don't like it. So we're still, we still have a dairy industry. And I told you last time that the guys that I respect the most in the world are dairy farmers, and I told you why. Because they're crack of dawn. And go to bed late. So we look at Pasteur and we see that he's about in the mid-1800s, 50 to 60. And this was an amazing time in the world. Does anybody know what was going on in the 1850s? Does anybody remember from history?
The
Yeah, that.
Renaissance or something like that?
The what? No,
The time of
not
enlightenment,
Renaissance.
the time of enlightenment, what's it called, there's a word for it. It was happening in France at the time, there was
Well,
like,
it wasn't the Renaissance, but what it was is basically the time of industrialization, the Industrial
but they
Revolution.
developed the steam engine at the time. and that's
Yeah,
what got
steam
things going.
engine and getting things places. A lot of what they thought were very modern things were happening. Well, the Industrial Revolution meant that people left their agrarian lifestyle and moved into cities. And that became a real problem for microbiology because as crowding takes place, there's more communication among people, more spread of disease. The living conditions deteriorated because the housing was crowded. A lot of people lived together. They brought the animals into the house at night. They couldn't leave them outside because people would steal them and run off with them. If you had a valuable pig, you slept with it. Seriously, because you couldn't leave them out. So what happened is the animals obviously produce waste products in the house, and that had to be swept out in the morning. So all animal excrement would have been swept out into the street in the morning. And then there was the problem of no bathrooms, so the people living in the houses also produced waste material. And what did they do with that? They threw it out the doors in the morning into the street. Rain was prayed for because that's the only way the streets got clean. And there was no sewage system. So you had all this junk lying around in the streets. Doesn't sound too pleasant, does it? They miss that in the movies, you know, when they're making a nice mid-1800s picture or late 1800s picture. They show people looking good and they didn't. They looked terrible. They were disgusting. It's a wonder there were any procreation going on at the time. Seriously. And the women wore long dresses, so as they moved in the streets, the hems of their dresses picked up the excrement that was out there and got caked on the bottom. I'm not kidding, by the way, this is true. Got caked on the bottom of their dresses. So you would have some of the writers talking about how the women swooned. Oh my God, if anybody threw that skirt over your head, you'd swoon too. Because it was pretty disgusting. And in Ireland, they developed nosegays, little nosegays that are bunches of flowers. So the ladies would take the nosegays and stick them in front of their nose and walk down the streets. And the men with hats would suspend a little bunch of flowers in front of their nose so they could walk down the street and not throw up. It was a time of great filth. And I guess there's a program on TV, which I have not seen yet, but it's called Nick. And it's about the early days of the Knickerbocker Hospital in New York. Has anybody seen any of those episodes? And can you tell us about them?
It's fantastic.
Oh. What channel is it on?
Cinemax.
Cinemax. I probably don't get that.
And it's very productive.
And it tells you the way things really work, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's very, very graphic.
Very graphic. Oh, we love that.
It's awesome.
It's really good, huh? Yeah, I've got to find a way to see it. My sense is that it would be really valuable if you were studying microbiology, that you would definitely want to see 1 or 2 episodes. And medicine as well, because it was pretty brutal.
There's also another one I've been into British period pieces lately, and it's called London Hospital.
Ah.
And that's a few years ago, it's over. That's really more true to life than a lot of them are. And it shows how microbes will kill you really quickly.
Yeah. Well, first of all, they didn't even know what microbes were in 1850. So the prevailing theory, if you got a disease, is that you were evil and God visited this disease on you to make you pay for whatever it is you did or didn't do. That's a lovely theory, isn't it? I mean, you're sick and the rest of your community thinks you're evil. Who's going to take care of you? And by the way, who did take care of people who got sick in those days? The family. Oh, and the church a little bit. But you were the responsibility of the family. And who wanted to touch you? It's like the Ebola thing now. Who wants to touch those people? Nobody. They don't have any protective gear? Yes.
Well, one of the original definitions of quarantine was if there was sickness in a house, and this was mostly in rural areas, they would stone your house up. They would just cover your, everybody would come in and they would just basically close off your doors, close off your windows, and shut your house in and leave you there for, 6 months to a year until you died and whatever killed you died, and then they just knock it all down. It was one of the original methods of quarantine was literally to block people in so they couldn't get out and just leave them.
Lovely. Then we went to the red signs. The red signs were put on doors where there was a contagious illness, so people wouldn't go in there too, so that was a step up. But same thing, which is actually still a method of containing illness, and in those villages that have Ebola, if you block any travel to or from the village, you're actually employing a type of quarantine to keep them isolated away from the rest of the world. Have we made any progress in some of these areas? I wonder. Well, we'll see.